and making sure we look like ourselves,
Okay.
more or less. All right. So I'm going to let folks in the chat room know to refresh their pages so that we actually appear for them.
Okay.
And we get started. Hi everyone, happy Thursday. My name is Emily and I'm the community manager here at 2Diabetes, working with the Diabetes Hands Foundation. And it's our Thursday live interview. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Mary Rooney, who is a child psychologist and a person with diabetes, who has participated in a clinical trial for people with type 1 diabetes. So a lot of what we're going to learn today is what that experience was like, how a clinical trial works, how you participate, how you get involved, and we're really excited to learn that. So welcome, Mary. The camera is on you.
Right.
And thank you so much for taking some time with us here today. I wondered if we could just start with sort of your story, your diagnosis, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a child clinical psychologist, and I specialize in ADHD. And it was back when I was just finishing up my degree about 3 years ago, after I just had moved to San Francisco, that I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So I was, I think, 35 at the time, and it kind of came, out of the blue, more or less. I didn't have any family history of anything related to type 1 diabetes or autoimmune disorders as far as I knew, and had kind of the classic symptoms, right? So I was losing weight, I was drinking water all the time, I was peeing all the time, my hair was falling out, I was getting blurry vision, but it was still a complete shock to me when the diagnosis came along. So, and I was lucky enough, though, to be at UCSF at the time, and had access to the team at UCSF. So I was lucky that even as an adult, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes right away. So I didn't have any confusion over was it type 2 diabetes or have kind of that misdiagnosis and really kind of the wrong treatment from the start. So I had great education and access to great resources right away. So in many ways, I was very lucky. So.
Yeah, so, and you started looking into clinical trials practically right away as soon as you were diagnosed. Can you talk about sort of what was your initial reaction to the diagnosis and how it was that you became so proactive, particularly in the area of clinical trials, so quickly?
Yeah, so my initial reaction was, of course, I was really completely shocked and pretty upset, initially, and feeling terrible, right? So it's pretty hard to kind of activate yourself to start doing things when you're completely run down and have just been sick, for a while without realizing what was going on. So I was, shocked and didn't know what to do. It was just kind of responding to what the doctors were telling me to do initially. But because I think just of my personality, I sort of, after even just a week of that, started feeling like, okay, well, I need to do something. I can't kind of just sit with this. And as I learned more, about what was actually happening with the disease process, that my immune system was basically attacking the cells in my pancreas, I think because I'm a researcher myself, kind of had this thought that, well, there must be people out there studying ways to make this stop, right, to make this attack of my immune system stop, and started looking into clinical trials because of that. So in some ways, I felt a bit of urgency around it, in the sense that, well, this is happening right now, and I don't have a lot of time if I want to preserve the insulin functioning that I have right now. So that probably helped in some ways to get me moving on it quickly. And so I didn't feel like I had a lot of time to just sit around. And so I started looking, and I really just started Googling. So even though I was working at UCSF, I didn't really actually go through any channels at UCSF at that time. I just started Googling clinical trials, type 1 diabetes, and was looking for things that were looking to preserve beta cell functions, which were the cells in the pancreas that are producing the insulin. And because I live in San Francisco, where there's a lot of medical centers and research centers that are looking at studies with type 1 diabetes, I was really lucky that there were a host of clinical trials really looking at people who were newly diagnosed.
Can you talk about what some of those trials were?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the one that I enrolled in last, but the studies that I saw that I was considering, the ones that were looking at stopping the autoimmune attack or preserving beta cell functioning were really looking at medications that were out there that were used for other autoimmune disorders. So there was one that was looking at a psoriasis drug that they were thinking, well, maybe this will help because it's, works with the immune system. And then another study that was a modified version of what I've since learned is often referred to as like the Brazil study, I think, which is a study where they basically gave participants a host of immunosuppressant drugs, very similar to what someone would get if they were going to get a transplant. And needed to suppress their immune system to be able to accept the donor organs. So it really knocks out your immune system and then rebuilds it back up. So they did that in Brazil, but in the U.S. it would be very hard to do a study like that because of the risks associated with it. So it was a modified version of that, where they give you a lot of immunosuppressants and then kind of allow your immune system to rebuild from there. So those were two that were going on that were medically related. And then there was another study. There were other studies, though, looking at getting people started on the pump and on CGMs right away, and looking at like if really tight control helps to preserve the insulin functioning that you have going on currently. So those studies were being done down at Stanford, the ones that were looking at pumps and CGMs for newly diagnosed individuals. And then the study that I ended up enrolling in was a study where it was looking at modifying the immune system and stopping the attack, but without using any drugs. So instead, they take some of your own T cells, so your regulatory T cells, which are a kind of basically kind of tell the immune system what to do. So the theory being that you might not have enough of those. So if the immune system is kind of going haywire, maybe you don't have enough regulation going on, so let's take those T cells and expand them in a lab and reinfuse you with more of them. And that's the study that I participated in. So
was the fact that it wasn't really a drug, but was you're given back sort of more of yourself in a way, was that one of the selling points on that one for you?
Yeah, ultimately that's the reason why I decided to go with that study. So I really considered all of them, and I thought about it very hard. And I got a lot of information about them ahead of time, and the doctors were great. I mean, they met with me, they explained each of them really thoroughly to me. I had all of the consent forms up front, so I was able to see all of the information about what was involved in each of the studies. And ultimately, I decided on the one that I participated in because there were no drugs involved, and I just really liked the idea of doing something that felt a little bit more natural to me. And I also liked the science behind it. Like it made sense to me, just logically in a lot of ways. And so I liked that aspect of it. And then a couple of the other trials, like the ones where they were using a psoriasis medication, for example, that to me, it just felt a little bit like, well, if it was that simple, like we have to take this medication that's out there that everybody's been using for so long and we just use that, like maybe it'll work, but to me it just seemed like, I don't know, I wasn't so sure about that one. So, and I also kind of thought through it in terms of like a layman's person kind of thinking about this and being like, well, like, I don't know if that one's really going to get us very far. So let's do something that's different and seems kind of natural and makes logical sense. So I went with that.
Process was of getting into that trial, and then sort of what were the inclusion criteria, what were the things that you had to do to sort of get started, and then how did it proceed through? What were the steps involved in the whole experience?
Yeah, so getting started, I was in this odd position of coming to them too early. So you have to have had the diagnosis for at least, I think it was 4 months. And by the time I was talking with them, I think I was about a month in to having the diagnosis. So I actually had a bit of a waiting period where they couldn't really start doing anything with me until I was at kind of the 4-month mark. So for about 3 months, I just really focused on learning about diabetes, managing it, and kind of getting things back under control. So in a way, I think it was great that I had that period in between, because it would have been really hard to just jump right in to being in a clinical trial too early. And so once I started the process of enrollment, you go through this whole consenting process where you really read through everything that's involved in the study, and the job of the consent is really to tell you everything that could possibly go wrong so that you really know what you're getting into. And then there's also kind of a small section on benefits of the study. So that part was really intimidating, because it's like, oh my gosh, you know, what am I getting into here? And these are the risks associated with it. And the study that I was in was a phase 1 trial, which means it was the first time this is being done in humans. So it was really designed to be looking at the safety of it, not as much of the effectiveness of it. Like the effectiveness is kind of secondary, but it's really looking to see if it's safe. So these were the most detailed consent forms that even as a researcher I'd ever seen. And it definitely gave me pause. You know, I was kind of like, oh my, what is this? But once I got through that and sort of took a step back and said, no, you know what, these risks are worth it. You know, the benefits outweigh the risks on this. So we got through that phase of consenting, and then it was really doing a bunch of blood draws and logging of my food and insulin, and looking to make sure that I was healthy enough to participate, and so that I didn't have anything else going on. I didn't have any history of cancer or anything where if your immune system is altered, you might kind of reactivate something that's already there. So mono, for example, like I have had like a history of exposure to Epstein-Barr, which I think is the virus that is behind mono. So because if you weren't exposed in the past, I guess, and then were to come into contact with someone who had that after your immune system has been modified, there's a risk that it could come on in a really bad form. So they were really looking at my full medical history and excluding some things. You know, there were some exclusion criteria if some of those things had been present in the past. So we have some great, I want to interrupt you for just a moment because we just got a slew of great questions in the chat room about this. One is, how do you evaluate whether a study is a really serious and legitimate study, or potentially some doctor's kind of pet project that's probably not all that likely to bear a whole lot of fruit? How does one figure that out? That's a really good question. And I think a few things that you can look at are where is the study being done, right? So is it at a medical center that has a really good team of people working on type 1 diabetes? So it's not just somebody working in isolation or at a smaller institution just by themselves. And where does the funding come from? So my study was funded by JDRF. And there's other studies that are funded by the Helmsley Foundation, other studies that are funded by NIH. And in order to get a grant from one of those organizations that's going to fund the study, you have to have done prior research that is kind of supporting what you're doing now. So you have to have a really good track record. And they have scientists on the boards at each of these organizations that review these grants in great detail. And they have to pass a really high threshold of having sound science behind them before they're going to be approved. So if you have somebody who has a grant through one of those foundations, then you're in good hands generally. And if they're at a good institution, they have institutional review boards, IRBs, that also look at each of these studies. And the whole job of the IRB is to protect the participants. So if they see anything that they think is not safe or is not worth the risk to the participant, then they don't approve the trials generally. So.
Another great question in the chat room was, how do you weigh the risks of the trial? And I know that you said that there's this incredibly long consent form that's really detailed about potential risks. And that can probably be really overwhelming, and probably a lot of those consent forms for different studies start out with kind of the same framework of risks. How do you actually figure out what that means and weigh and measure whether it's something that you want to take the risk to do?
Yeah, and I think that's something where the risks mean something different to everybody. And so I think that it's a really personal decision. And I think it's something where I found myself giving a lot of thought to that. Like, well, what if this didn't go well? What if something went wrong? Am I in a place where I have access to doctors and to support where I can get help that I need if something doesn't go right? What else do I have going on in my life right now? So am I able to kind of take extra time out if I have to handle something that might not go right? And can I sit with the risks, right? So am I somebody who can kind of sit here and say, okay, I know that I'm taking a chance, and is that something where I can handle kind of the anxiety that comes with it? And I think that's just something you have to kind of sit with and think through yourself, and talk to people in your life, right? The people who are around you, and get their take on it. It was really important to me, so when I went to those meetings with the doctors, I brought friends with me, because it was really important to me to have other people hearing what I was hearing, because it can be an overwhelming amount of information. And you trust your own judgment, but at the same time, you kind of need other people who care about you to be there and say, wait a minute, are you sure you want to put yourself in that position? Or it might seem like it's worth the risk to you, but we're seeing it from a different perspective, and we want to make sure that you're really thinking this through. So I think I have a lot of confidence in the doctors who I was working with. I have a lot of confidence in the science behind it, and a lot of confidence in the people who are reviewing the clinical trials. So I felt really like I was in good hands. So even though I knew I was taking a chance, I also knew that there were so many people behind the scenes looking out for the people who were participating in the studies. And so I had a lot of confidence in everybody there. And I think so for me, I knew that what I was reading was something that was just the front level of so many other people behind them, kind of thinking about whether or not this was something that was safe for people to try. So I was coming at it from that perspective. And I think if you're able to trust the doctors and trust the people behind the scenes, then it's much easier to say, okay, you know what, I'm in good hands, and this is something that I'm willing to do.
Mm-hmm. So what were the inclusion criteria for the study that you did?
I think you had to be an adult, so I don't remember the exact age range. I was on the upper cusp of it, so I think it was around 35. I think they might have expanded it up to 40. You had to be in generally good health other than having a recent diabetes diagnosis, and the diagnosis had to occur sometime between the last 4 months and up to 2 years. And I'm trying to think what else it was. I think, and also just being able to make the appointments and be able to, be there for follow-up visits and all of those things. So logistics were, also a concern. But overall, I think the inclusion criteria, other than some of those other details I mentioned earlier, like having had exposure to Epstein-Barr virus and some other kind of random things that I would never think of, and other things that they were looking at, I think through blood draws that I can't remember now, that were either ruling people in or ruling people out. It was really more pretty general, I would say.
So once you were in,
mm-hmm.
and you had signed all the consent forms and read all of the potential risks and met all of the people behind the scenes and the doctors involved and everything, then what happened? What kind of time commitment did it take from you? How many appointments did you have? How did the whole participation work from then on?
So there were a lot of appointments initially. So the blood draws were kind of the main thing that I was having a lot of, and that was partially kind of safety, making sure that things were still looking good, and then also just for their data collection, because what they were really looking at over time was how things were changing inside of me, not so much what I was reporting to them. And so I think that was something that was really interesting for me, because as a psychologist, when I do research, it's all based on like what somebody tells me, right? I don't really know what's, I'm not looking at markers inside of them. So for this, it was like just I show up and they're taking my vital signs and doing blood draws and also looking at my logs, but it was much more about what the labs were saying. And then they did some mixed meal tolerance tests also, which for those, it's basically looking at your insulin production over the course of roughly a 4-hour period while you're consuming a boost drink or what is it, Ensure. So some beverage where they know exactly what's in it. So that's all part of their thing. So you can't have had anything else. It's a really controlled amount of this beverage, and then they track every 30 minutes. They do a blood draw over the course of 4 hours. And you don't take any insulin during that time. So they look and see what your blood glucose levels are, and then I think they're tracking how much insulin is being produced at those different time points, I think, along with a few other things. And then they were looking for change in that over time. So we had to do that. I had to do that multiple times. So before, yeah, that part was a little taxing. So you had to do that before, and then at like multiple time points afterwards. So the time commitment was mostly in getting to the lab and doing those mixed meal tolerance tests, in doing follow-up phone calls afterwards and also beforehand, and in doing a lot of logging. So I was logging all of my the insulin I was taking, all the food I was eating, and then checking in with a diabetes educator every 2 weeks to adjust my pump settings or to talk about what was going on with my blood sugar levels during that time.
Mm-hmm. So you were really newly diagnosed when you embarked upon this. Were you in any level of honeymooning at that point? Do you know?
Yeah. So I was really in the honeymoon phase, and I still am, I think, actually. So one of the goals of the study, I know it's pretty exciting. So it's 3 years out now, a little over 3 years, and I'm still honeymooning. And that was one of the goals of the study, was to really, prolong the honeymoon phase. And so when I started, my insulin doses that I needed have certainly increased since when I was first diagnosed, but they've really held steady for about the last year and a half, with minimal changes, I would say, to my pump settings, maybe even over the last 2 years with minimal changes. So I've been able to stay in the honeymoon phase, but during the kind of year and a half after my diagnosis, we were making like slight adjustments to my pump settings pretty regularly to kind of account for some changes. But definitely still honeymooning, which is pretty awesome.
It is super awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
I think I just finally fell out of my honeymoon phase, 37 years in.
Oh, man.
I don't think I ever had a honeymoon. I'm not sure. I was too young to know anyway.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic that hopefully that did extend your honeymoon phase. Were you given any information as you were going through the tests and the mixed meal glucose tolerance and all of that stuff? Were they able to share any of the information with you about the markers that they were looking for and what they were finding through your blood work?
Not really, and I think that was kind of by design. I know, I was always curious, and every once in a while, one of the nurses would tell me what my blood sugar level was at one of those 30-minute time points. I would just kind of casually ask, and then they would just kind of casually tell me. So I was like, okay, I kind of get some information that way. But they weren't really giving me details about what they were finding, and I think that was part of the study design. So, if they tell you the risk is that you're going to do something differently, either, if it seems like it's not working, then, I think it's pretty easy to feel like, oh, well, why am I even trying? And, why am I even bothering? Like, nothing's working. And then if it is working, then maybe that helps motivate you to do something else differently. So then how do you parse out, like, what's because of the study or what's because of what I'm doing as the participant? So because of that, they can't really tell you, which is kind of frustrating. But because the effect ultimately is on how much insulin I'm needing, I can kind of tell by whether my insulin doses have changed. So in some ways, you can't help but know what's happening. But I don't know in terms of, like, when they reinfuse me with the Tregs cells, like, did they stick around or not? I don't know, any of that information.
Mm-hmm. We just got a question in the chat room that is what you were just talking about, but how do you know if you're honeymooning?
So you know if you're honeymooning more or less based on how much insulin you need on a day-to-day basis. So your doctor can kind of tell you, like, based on an average adult who's not producing any insulin, this is how much insulin they might need, like what your insulin to carb ratio is, or how much basal insulin you need. And they can also tell if they do a C-peptide test, which measures the amount of insulin production at any point in time. So my C-peptide levels were being measured during the study, but I don't know what the outcome was. But you can request that from your doctor. Some doctors will do it, some give a little pushback on that because they might not feel like it's necessary. So if you've had diabetes for a really long time and your insulin dose levels have been stable, they might feel like, well, we don't really need this information because we're controlling it anyway. I think it's nice to have. I actually asked my doctor to do it for my next visit, and he said that would be fine, just because I'm curious. So, but that's mainly how you know. So in theory, your blood sugar is easier to control when you're in a honeymoon phase because you're still producing a significant amount of your own insulin, but obviously not enough to cover everything that you need.
So, you're a clinical psychologist.
I am.
So I'm going to talk about feelings.
Okay.
So you went through this period of time where you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and then immediately, or almost immediately, got into a clinical trial that had hopes of extending this period of time in the beginning of your life with diabetes that would presumably be easier than the rest of your time with diabetes, this honeymoon phase. And you had to have a complete stew of emotions going on about all of this, the diagnosis, and then also the hopes and fears about the clinical trial. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, so in some ways it's so much that it's really hard to then like parse it all out and remember what it was all like in some ways. And a lot of it still comes up, so it's not like it just happened then and then now it's like, oh, I've moved on. It comes and goes a lot of times, but I think initially it was feeling really overwhelmed. And then I kind of shifted to, I'm going to cope with this, and I'm going to be a master coper, right? So it's like, okay, I'm going to deal with this, and I'm going to be proactive, and I'm going to do everything that the doctors are saying, and I'm going to pull back on other things that I have going on so I can make sure I've got a lot of balance in my life, and I'm going to like be masterful at this. And so, of course, that lasts for about 6 months.
I'm going to have more balance than anyone's ever had.
Exactly. I'm going to cope. And then it's like, okay. So meanwhile, my doctors are kind of freaking out for me. And they're like, wait, you're going to burn out. You can't, like this is too much. You want to go on a pump now, too, and you're in this clinical trial, and you want a CGM, and, like, what, this is too much. And I'm saying, no, it'll be fine. I'm not going to burn out. Or if I burn out, I'll cope. So it's that kind of response is how I roll. So that worked for about 6 months, and then it kind of got like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, and it wasn't so much that at that time I felt like the diabetes itself was overwhelming. It was more like, well, wait, how can I keep up with everything else in my life while I'm being 100% on top of the diabetes? So I think the pendulum kind of swung, I wouldn't say all the way in the other direction, but just more back to like, wait a minute, I have a lifetime of this that I'm going to have to deal with, and how do you live a life and do everything that is required for managing your diabetes?
That's a $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, and I think that there's no answer to that, right? And so I've kind of come to a place of acceptance where you're kind of going to go back and forth. Like sometimes you're really on top of the diabetes stuff because life isn't throwing 1,000 things at you, and then other times when there's so much going on, in the middle of all this in the last 3 years, I finished up my postdoc stuff at UCSF, and I moved back to Manhattan for a year, and then decided I'd rather be in San Francisco, so I moved back to San Francisco at the end of that year and started another job. So with all of that going on, my diabetes management couldn't be as perfect as, I would like or anybody else would like. And so some of it is just saying, well, you know what, this is what life's looks like right now, and I'm just going to do the best that I can. So I think I spend a lot of my mental energies reminding myself that all I can do is the best that I can, and I'm working with imperfect tools, like the insulin doesn't match the food the way it should, and my CGM, is calibrated with my meter about 10% of the time, and like it's just, I'm doing the best that I can with imperfect methods, and this is what we've got. And what we've got is a lot better than what we used to have. So I'm lucky that I can even do what I can. And so I think I just say that to myself. Honestly, I think I say that about like once or twice a day. So.
Only once or twice.
Well, yeah, because the rest of the time I'm like,
I am amazed. I'm amazed at your perspective on this, particularly around the imperfect tools. I think for a lot of folks, a lot of people are taught right up front when they're diagnosed with diabetes that, don't worry, we want to empower you. This is all in your hands because we've got great tools, as you said, much better than what we used to have. And so if you work hard and you do the math and you eat carefully and all this stuff, then you have control over this thing. And I think for a lot of folks it takes what feels like an eternity to recognize that even with the wonderful tools that we have, we still don't mimic what the body actually does if you don't have diabetes, to control blood sugar. And so I think it's incredible that you already know that so early on in your life with diabetes. Did that come from your care team? Did that come from you? How did you get to this point?
I'm not sure, actually. I am lucky that I had a really good group of diabetes educators and doctors, working at UCSF with me. And it might be that I got that message early on because I was trying to do things so, quote unquote, perfectly around my diabetes management. And I did have, people pushing back at me saying, well, wait a minute, like you can only do so much, don't check your blood sugar more than, 2 hours after, less than 2 hours after you've eaten, because the numbers are going to be high, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's just how the insulin works. And so I think in some ways I had that message coming probably back to me, and then in other ways I think I just spent a lot of time researching what I could do, and constantly found the answers kind of coming up short in terms of mimicking what the body was able to do. So I also developed this huge respect for my pancreas and the body, and it's kind of like, oh my God, that is an amazing machine. Like, how does that work? And realizing how little we know. So, and some of it too might just come from my background in being a psychologist and a researcher, and recognizing across the board with that how limited we are and what we're able to do. There's a lot we can do, but in terms of drugs or medications for mental illnesses, we're really limited in being able to mimic what a healthy body is able to do. So.
Here's a question in the chat room that I kind of love, and that is, were you surprised by how much time it takes to try to manage?
So you cut out a little bit there. So was I surprised by how much time it takes to manage diabetes?
Yeah.
Yes. I think I didn't really have an understanding at all of how much time it takes, and some of that comes from the fact that I had a couple of friends when I was younger, in middle school and high school, who were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes then, and they didn't have the same tools that we have now at that time. So the amount of time it took for them to manage it was much less, but their control was also not as good. So with all of the advancements we've had has come a much greater burden associated with managing the disease, and I think that's something that really surprised me in part because of that.
Here's another good one in the chat room. We're switching gears a little bit, but David was asking, since you're a clinical child psychologist, do you have any patients who have diabetes, or have you ever? And if so, how has your own diabetes potentially affected your work with them?
So yeah, I haven't had any patients with diabetes yet, and so some of that's because I spend a lot of my time on research and less time seeing patients. So I do treatment development research, so we have participants in our studies, but the patients that I have seen since I've been diagnosed haven't had diabetes, and I have thought about that a lot. Like, is that something that I want to start to do, where I work with families of kids who have diabetes, or kids who have anxiety and diabetes, or ADHD and diabetes? And I think for myself, I kind of come from two different places with that. So on the one hand, I feel like I could have potentially a lot to offer as a psychologist who has diabetes, just like the diabetes educators who we work with who have diabetes, or the doctors who have diabetes and nurses. You feel like they get it more. And then the flip side of it is, well, what effect is that going to have on me as a person managing the disease if I'm surrounded by it often, where it's at my work and then it's also in my personal life. And so I think I probably would like to start working with a few families where diabetes affects them as well, and see how that goes. So I think it could probably be a benefit that I have insight into it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely seems so. We get a lot of street cred with one another, I think. So it's a condition that probably pretty hard to really understand if you don't have it.
I think so, yeah.
So getting back to clinical trials, I want to talk more about the one that you participated in, but also at this point, your thoughts about clinical trials in general and participation in research for people who have diabetes.
Yeah. So where do you want to start with that? Because
let's finish off. We've gotten through talking about sort of the chronology of your experience with the T-Reg study that you participated in, but we haven't gotten to the very end. So how long did that study last? And what happens at the end of a clinical trial? If you've participated, do they throw you a party? Do you get a special letter that says the results of the study? What happens?
So my participation in the study has more or less finished. So they followed me for a total of 2 years. So there was one day that was kind of like the big day where I got the infusion reinfused with the T cells, and that was kind of a big day for everybody because it was the first time that they had done that in people or someone with type 1 diabetes. So there was a lot of excitement around that. And then they followed me for about 2 years really closely. So that's where I was meeting with the diabetes educator over the phone every 2 weeks and all that. And then now they're continuing, I think, every 6 months or so to contact me over the phone and just check in. So that'll go on for 5 years. So at the end of the 2 years, it was really just kind of like, okay, well, we'll talk to you on the phone in a few months. Bye. And so since I was the first one in the study, it's been also just waiting for the other participants to finish up before we have all the results. They do have preliminary results, and I heard about that, so they kind of kept me in the loop. And I was able, since the ADA conference was in San Francisco this year, I was able to go down and I see the presentation of the results at that conference, so that was pretty cool. But that isn't necessarily what typically happens, so a lot of times you don't really necessarily know what the results are at the end. You can contact the team and say, hey, do you have any publications on this, and they'll send you what they have. But I think overall, and this is something I learned as being a participant rather than the researcher, is overall I think we do not such a great job of keeping participants in the loop at the end, like as to what the results are. And some of that is I think everybody just gets busy. And you're busy writing up papers and things, but I know that going forward I'm making a much more conscious effort to keep participants in the loop and say, you know what, these are the results and you were a really important part of this, which is something we know, but I think I haven't always acknowledged at the end of the study in the way that I should have kind of given that feedback. So I think it's there, but you kind of have to seek it out. And then in terms of kind of clinical trials going forward, or like kind of just the importance of clinical trials in general, I think something that I've learned from this is just how important it is to be the participant, and that these studies, it's not something that this is just kind of happening out there and we're reading about them. it's something where those studies literally can't happen if the people who have type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, if we don't step up and say, I'm going to participate, none of this research will happen if we don't do that. And I think that's something that I understood maybe logically, but I didn't really understand until I participated. And so it's something I've become a lot more passionate about, through this experience, I would say.
Do you think that you will participate in other trials in the future?
Probably. I think just because it's something I feel like is important, but I think it's something that you have to do it when the time feels right for you, because it is a big time commitment. It's a time commitment, and there's also an emotional commitment that goes with it. So during the time when I was in the trial, diabetes was very front and center in my brain most of that time, because I had people asking for my logs all the time, or you're just kind of actively participating. And I think that at different points in your life, that's totally fine. And then there's times in your life where you really need it to not be front and center in your brain because you've got so much going on. So I think as long as the timing's right, yeah, I'll totally participate again. And I think also I just try and stay informed, and I try and just keep the conversation going about it, because it's, I think I feel like a responsibility to participate, but I also feel like other people would gladly get involved if they sort of knew it was an option and knew how to, that they were wanted, I think. So, and as I feel frustrated at times with the tools that we have available, and the fact that they're imperfect, I also recognize that the only way that they're going to become more perfect is through research. So we are part of the process of moving that forward, I think.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, I've been interested in participating in clinical trials for a long time, but one of the things that has always kind of stalled me out a bit, and I have not participated in trials so far, was the possibility that if I participated in this trial, then I would not be able to participate in another trial down the road that I might also be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about trying to weed your way through that potential dilemma?
Yeah, so I think that that's certainly true that there's certain trials you could be excluded from because you participated in a different one, but there's also plenty of studies that do stay open to people who have participated before. So, sometimes it's not like a huge trial, basically beta cell transplant trial, or or the bionic pancreas trial, or the clinical trial that I was in. That's only open to people who are newly diagnosed. There's lots of other trials out there too, like ones that are just looking, I shouldn't say just, but looking at new versions of CGMs that are coming out, or looking at. Honestly, I saw a trial the other day when I was Googling. They're looking at Skittles as a treatment for hypoglycemia. Yeah, it was called the Skittles trial, and I had to read it multiple times, and I was like, no, there's definitely a trademark after the word Skittles. It's not a funny acronym for something. And so, I already know that Skittles is a good treatment for hypoglycemia because I use them all the time. So I don't want to say there's not value in that research, because there's something valuable in everything, but it just kind of highlights the fact that there's different kinds of studies out there, so there's always something to participate in. And I think you can still participate in some of those other studies even if you've been in a more major clinical trial. But I think the main thing is to kind of just jump in and participate in something, because the danger is in that you're kind of waiting for the one that's the most perfect or the most beneficial, and then by the time that comes around, you're sort of like, well, it's not the right time, or you missed the opportunity to participate in a bunch of others. So.
We have some questions in the chat room about how you make your own decisions about your diabetes management, and one is about whether you use any apps or any other kind of tools in addition to your pump and your CGM to make your own decisions and figure out how much insulin you need, those kinds of things. And we also have a related question about whether you still work as closely with your care team as you did while you were really actively in the T-reg study, to adjust insulin dosages and basal rates and things like that, or whether at this point you're kind of doing that on your own.
Yeah, so in terms of other tools that I use, I actually haven't found an app that I've found to be extremely helpful, at least from a logging standpoint. I do use MyFitnessPal a lot. It's like myfitnesspal.com to look up carbs and sometimes to track my food that way. So if I'm kind of trying to see how many carbs I'm eating in a day, or if I'm having kind of funky insulin responses at different times, to see if there's any patterns and realize, like, oh yeah, well, I'm eating mostly carbs for lunch every day for the last 3 weeks with like not that much protein or anything, and I think I need to make that shift. So I'll use MyFitnessPal for that. But when it comes to actually logging things, I actually use paper logs still. I know it's shocking. I use them not all the time, but just when things start to get kind of funky and I need to figure out what's going on again, I actually go back to the paper logs that I started using right when I was first diagnosed. And I found that to be the most helpful and also the most annoying. So I think that's why I don't use it most of the time. So if anybody knows of any apps out there that are great for keeping logs, I'm happy to hear about them. And then how do I know, like, how to adjust my insulin and stuff? I don't work with my care team closely anymore at all, actually. So one of the benefits of being in a clinical trial is that you have access to that. And just because we don't have enough, endocrinologists out there, really, it's just so hard to get appointments and be seen regularly when things are generally going okay. You're kind of, they need to deal with people who are in crisis a lot. So I see my doctor about once every 4 months. And in between that, if things are kind of off, I do my paper logs and I kind of make adjustments based on that. And if I'm really having a hard time figuring something out, then I call my doctor's office and I either get an appointment or I get in to see a diabetes educator who works there and work with them to make adjustments. But honestly, I've been really lucky in that my insulin needs haven't changed much in the last year, so I haven't had to make many adjustments. So
nice. So we have come close to the end of our time, and at least at the moment there aren't any more questions in the chat room, although we do have a suggestion of an app for you called My Sugar.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to check it out as soon as we get off, so that's awesome.
You haven't checked that one out before?
No, I actually don't know about that one. So
awesome. It's sugar. It's spelled, it's M-Y-S-U-G-R, I think. Am I right about that? I think so. For My Sugar. And, oh, look, there. We as a community could teach you a little something during our interview as well.
Teach me a lot, I'm sure. So,
Mary, I hope that you will spend some time cruising around 2 Diabetes as well, because you're one of us.
Oh, definitely. And I have, just so you guys know, especially when I was first diagnosed, I was on 2 Diabetes all the time, checking stuff out, reading stuff that you guys were posting, and it was extremely helpful. I wasn't kind of contributing at the time. I was more just reading. And my guess is there's probably a lot of people out there doing that, so I found the site so helpful, and I think for me it definitely made me realize how many great people there are out there who are dealing with the same thing that I'm dealing with. So I'll definitely have to get back on there and maybe actually post.
I love to hear, and I'm sure that our community watching loves to hear as well, that you got some really good value when you were first diagnosed out of reading things on 2 Diabetes and learning from the community. That's exactly what we're here for and exactly what the site is about. And so since we're about out of time, I want to thank you heartily for your time today and leave with this final question, which is going to be a bit of a recap, which is for folks who are watching who are interested in potentially participating in clinical research relating to diabetes, how would you suggest they move forward with that interest? Is it a search?
Yeah, so there's a few websites out there that are kind of the ones that kind of round up all of the details about a bunch of studies. And I think there's clinicaltrials.gov is a major one. Trialnet.org is another one that's great. And there's also kind of a newer organization out there called myglu.org, and it's myglu.org. You can friend them on Facebook, and then you get updates about different studies that are going on. And they actually collect data through that organization. So researchers will kind of survey people in the organization who are members of myblue.org to ask them if they'd be willing to participate, or even just to get information about things like mood and anxiety and all that stuff that's related to diabetes as well. And all of that's really valuable. So even participating when somebody says, will you complete a survey, is a great way to get involved too. And JDRF also has a lot of info, and Helmsley Foundation as well probably has some info if you Google them. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Oh, wait, I'm going to put the camera back on you so that you can say goodbye to the community.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you on 2 Diabetes. I'll get on there, and I'll post instead of just checking everything out. So.
Oh, good. Good. We look forward to seeing you out and about in the community.
Awesome.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.